But first let me start by saying I know that my job on this panel is to address the future and perhaps paint a scenario of the future. And I know it's very bad form for historians to make predictions. And especially for medievalists, I feel extremely queasy doing that. Especially as someone who studied Russian, when of course most Russianists had no idea that the Soviet Union was going to collapse, at least those who had never actually visited the Soviet Union. Those of us who had lived there had a different view. But I want to be, I guess, a grain of sand in the oyster and hope that we come out with a pearl. So I will say some provocative and, like a jam, rather categorical things, whether I believe them or not. I think it's possible for them to become true. First, I want to start by just giving a sense of your reading habits, not your publishing habits. But I want to know how many of you this morning read a newspaper in print. Okay, how many of you read the news online? And how many of you did both? Okay.
People who didn't read the news.
Okay, a minority of one. Well done. Sometimes I actually listen to the news. Maybe that counts as the same thing. So I'm not talking to a group that doesn't understand that this is not an either-or situation. This is a both-and. And we're in a point of transition when we will be very melancholy about what we know is at risk of losing, and then to be overly optimistic about all the things that we will gain. And the only way we're going to balance these bipolar moods is only through forging ahead, and doing so consciously, and as engineers say, do and learn, and do again. Which is, I have finally learned in the digital world, the only way that you can make progress. And it's a pretty, as digital people say, it's a robust way of operating. I'm going to be an irritant by actually addressing this as an economic problem with a series of trade-offs. And by economics, I don't mean money or business. I mean it the way Adam Smith meant it, which is how is it that societies as a whole allocate scarce resources? And it's a whole question of the mechanisms for allocation, which is what most economists focus on. But the underlying issue is what is it that we value, and what is it that society actually is willing to pay for? And I think Tony hinted to something which is a very dark foreboding of the universities, which is our leadership no longer considers it a worthwhile investment in the resources that we need because they don't understand the value that we add to their community. And that is very different from the days that Coolidge ran the university and also built the Great Islamic Collection at Harvard University that produced many scholars. I want to say that we're seeing, in fact, economies of scarcity and economies of abundance actually colliding in a very ugly but interesting way, which actually should be a Hollywood movie because I can only imagine the digital effects. The economies of scarcity actually are ours as human beings. We have limited time and attention. They are infinitely scarce, and in fact, they're flat. And I think from a subjective point of view, we think that they're declining radically. On the other hand, the economies of abundance are on all the opportunities, all the things that we have to know and that we could know. And the mastery of the sources is, in fact, one of the most aggravating things about graduate education now is what's the cap on the infinitude of things we have to know? And what's the cap on the number of monographs we have to publish in order to get a job that rewards us for some of the effort that we put into getting the degree? So we are not, as a community, well prepared to address any of these questions. And I say that, again, categorically, because as was discovered when the American Council of Learned Societies convened their task force on what to them was the future, the cyber infrastructure for humanities and sciences, one of the very first things that we learned when we did investigation about the existing infrastructure for scholarship is that scholars are very divorced from the realities of the infrastructure that support their work. In fact, there's an incredible infrastructure which supports an extremely rarefied, stratospheric kind of conversation among humanists. And humanists tend to be generally oblivious to what is the infrastructure that supports it and the crisis that those infrastructures are undergoing now. And those the pieces of the infrastructure are the library and the publishing industry. And the reason why we can afford to be oblivious is because they worked so well before. visible infrastructure is infrastructure that works. Well, it doesn't work anymore. So we have, on the one hand, libraries who have always represented scholars as readers and researchers, and publishers who've represented scholars as the authors. And you can see already that these are in fact conflicting roles that scholars play. And it's a good thing that they have two different proxy organizations representing their interests, because they do not, they are competing interests, not just, complementary interests. And you see that the scholars who are for Google book search and the scholars who are against it actually line up across that over the default line between scholar as user, who just wants more and more and more, but better and better and better, but more and more, and the scholars who are lining up with those concerned about authors' rights and the role of publishing. And they're reconcilable, they have to be reconcilable, but in ways that we are too impoverished in our imagination to think about. So we have to just do some things and learn from them. So I would say that we are, that our infrastructure is changing in ways that is very dynamic and could be frightening. It could also be incredibly thrilling. And I think some of the things that we've seen with graduate students is that they tend to focus, as young people do, on the extraordinary opportunities, how incredibly thrilling it is with the opportunities that they have. And the one thing that we are not doing well to make that, to build on that sort of thrill factor, is we are not making their entry into the senior ranks of scholarship easy. And that's another area where I hope that AHA takes a leadership role in trying to make the graduate population, which does see the opportunities of digital scholarship, both as researchers and as publishers, make that actually count for something in the academy, which keeps them in the academy, or they leave, as so many of them are doing in droves. So the short scenario I want to sketch out for us to think about, and I will say something about libraries because I don't have time to say anything about publishers, although that would be an interesting topic to get into, is that as more materials move online, libraries will be moving an increasing amount of materials off-site. And it is not just because people are invidiously thinking about what to do about the central library, it's because their collections are too big to hold on.